Although I don't want to walk in front of the camera at all, so maybe I should get on this side.
Up to you.
Huh? Hello. Yeah.
Sometimes you get phrase because sometimes you got too many. Manage the people rather than getting stuff done. It's coming up. All came together.
Is it coffee? Yes, it's good. Three. Almost three, yeah. Do it a bit later, too.
Oh, yes.
Hello.
Is that for me?
Hello.
Welcome.
Yeah, the extension was built in 2003 or 4.
Maybe I
Okay.
but from the school we made it was
Welcome back.
Would you like a cup of tea or coffee? Yes.
Are there any forms which yesterday?
This is just too strong for you.
Yeah, we were
Take sugar.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
I put the sugar in. And then the hot stuff. No, it's not.
No?
It's like
I've been indoors almost all day, so it's nice that
Everyone needs a drink.
that's all right. I want to keep these two positions on. So they're very close, but yeah.
Yeah, I never bothered getting one of those.
Yeah, what how if they want to take lunch.
This is why we changed it.
Last time told you. No, may I explain?
Wait another 5 minutes? Omar, about 5 minutes. Okay.
We've got a few minutes.
Yeah, well, about 5 minutes. Thanks. There you are. And you don't want anything hot to drink as well?
No, that's more than enough. Thank you. More than enough.
लाइब्रेरी में बता दें लाइब्रेरी है आधे बताइए और
Moving chair. No way.
You had the,
There's what, it needs wheels in it.
yeah. He has a whole, like, something.
Does it?
Not the same thing,
first time when first we got to reverence it, looks like I'm looking forward to
this. I'm just wiping the chair off onto a plate, but he'll just drop the plate right now. Thank you. I don't think he likes it. I didn't think he would. I'm just gonna. Yeah. He's cleaning the chair.
Working perfectly. Turn it on.
You actually took a chair because I wasn't there. Somebody might have sit in it, or probably not. But I think anybody comes in a bit late.
Good to go.
Well, good, yeah.
Camera's rolling, by the way. So. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Bromley Reformed Synagogue. If we've never met before, but I think I met everyone, I'm Rabbi Jason Holtz. I'm the rabbi of the synagogue, and I'm really delighted that Dr. Omar Taha has joined us today. Omar and I are going to speak about the prophet Abraham, somebody who shared between our two traditions. We're going to go back and forth, sharing stories, lessons. Actually, Omar, you haven't really told me too much about what you're talking about. I haven't told you too much about what I'm talking about. So we'll all be learning today. And we're just going to pass the microphone back and forth. The reason why we have this microphone, there's a camera in the back which is going directly over everybody's head, unless you happen to stand up right over here, because we have a few people who can't physically come to the synagogue, and we do like to share opportunities to learn with them. So hopefully that's okay. This is the microphone right here. It's, as you can tell, very small, and I'm holding it right here. It may pick up something else in the room, but really it's meant for being very close to the speaker, so it shouldn't really pick up too many private conversations. But just so you know, it is being recorded at the moment right now. I'm actually going to be the second speaker today. Omar is going to get us started by sharing something about the Prophet Abraham from Islam. I'm not really sure what you're teaching about, so we'll all learn today. Here you are.
I hope it's about Islam. Thank you, Jason. It's an absolute pleasure to be back here again. It's always such a warm and welcoming atmosphere here in the synagogue every time I've come. And actually, I just want to take this moment to say thank you to everyone involved here at the synagogue for your kindness, for your hospitality, and for your continuous generosity. Thank you very much. Abraham. Something that I realized, or I should say my wife made sure that I realized, was that between the two of us, Jason, we managed to organize a talk on a great patriarch, father of our two faiths, on Mother's Day. I think that's what happens when you have two relatively new fathers organize an event. Abraham, he holds a huge and colossal weight within Islam. What we're going to try and do today is touch upon the significance and importance of Abraham within Islam, and then look at two aspects of Abraham's life, two dimensions, two phases within Abraham's journey that, when combined together, make up the very fabric of what the Islamic faith is all about. So Abraham's importance, his significance. Abraham is nothing short of a role model to every single Muslim. For us Muslims, we pray 5 times a day. Within our prayers, we mention Abraham's name. We recognize the blessings that God has sent upon Abraham and the family of Abraham. By extension of that, we face, in our direction of prayer, Mecca. And in particular, the large, you may have seen, black cube-like structure, the Kaaba, within Mecca. As Muslims, we believe Abraham built that. And Mecca itself, as a place, has great significance when it comes to Abraham for Muslims. For us, we go, for those who can, on the pilgrimage to Hajj once in our lifetime. The practices of Hajj, we believe, are rooted and originated by the Prophet Abraham. I'm just going to touch upon a couple of verses within the Quran that highlight the significance of Abraham. So there's a chapter in the Quran named the chapter of Abraham. And Abraham is named, he's given the title in the Quran as the Khalil of God, the dear, close friend of God. And one verse in particular that I think puts Abraham's position and status within Islam into perspective is where the Prophet Muhammad is told to follow the way, the footsteps, the path of Abraham. So, Abraham, I said that there were two aspects, two phases within his life. I'm going to try and look at phase 1 during this part of the talk, and then in the second half we'll look at phase 2. Phase 1, I'm going to term it faith, a reasoned approach. What we understand when we look at the life of Abraham, in particular his early days growing up as a young man, is that he is a man who is deep in thought. He is a man who is constantly engaged in reflection, introspection, contemplation about the universe, about the world, about existence, about how we got here. And Abraham's not afraid to question those around him. He's not afraid to question the status quo. He will critique his society. He will critique his family, in particular his own father. And in the story, the short story that I'm going to share today, he will also challenge the authority when it comes to faith. And I said it's a short story, there's relevance in its brevity. At the time of Abraham, we believe the king is King Nimrod. King Nimrod, as a character, we understand him to have a sort of pharaonic complex about him. He believes that he is God. He believes that he is the creator. And so he catches wind of this young man causing a theological stir within society. And so he calls Abraham to him. He challenges Abraham to a debate. And he says, Abraham, who is this God that you worship? Who is this creator that you are talking about? Abraham, he replies, he says, I believe in the one who creates and takes away life. The king replies, well, I create and take away life. And as the story goes, he brings 2 prisoners forward and he says, you are sentenced to death, you can stay alive. Abraham changes tack. He says, well, I believe in the one who makes the sun rise from the east. So why don't you go ahead and make it rise from the west? The king has nothing to say. And as the story goes, that's the end of the story. That's actually the end of the story. And I said there was relevance in its brevity. See, for me personally, at least, along my faith journey, I delved into different concepts, different ideas, different sources of literature, teachers, looking at concepts such as epistemology, ontology, consciousness, quantum theory, Kantian theory, you name it, all these different concepts and ideas as I was trying to make sense of the universe, of the world, of our existence. But by the end of all of that search, and in all honesty, I respect people within these fields because really these concepts stretch your mind. But by the end of this search, of this journey of mine, it was actually the Abrahamic rationale and reason which appealed to me most. Why? One, he keeps it simple. He's essentially looked at the 2 different possibilities. Either the universe came about by itself, that the creation had a hand in its own creation, or he looks beyond creation. He says actually creation has a far more intelligent, powerful creator. And Abraham goes for this latter possibility. But also, this rationale of Abraham could appeal to anyone. It could appeal to my nan. It could appeal to my teenage brother. It could appeal to the world's greatest philosopher, world's greatest scientist. It could appeal to the individual in a far distant village, the illiterate man. This concept, this simple reasoning of Abraham was open to all. This was phase 1 of Abraham's life. Faith, a reasoned approach. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you for sharing all that. It sounds so familiar to things that I've learned, both in the Jewish tradition, but I also took a degree in philosophy at university, which prompted my father to ask me, what in the world are you going to do with that? And I said, I don't know, I think I might want to become a rabbi. And what's clear to me is that so much in the overlapping periods of history between our 2 traditions is that a lot of these questions have been discussed between the faith traditions as well. I remember reading about philosophers and theologians, both Jewish and Muslim, say in medieval Spain or in Egypt or in all these different areas where our 2 different faiths came together and people weren't afraid to discuss them back and forth and really found, as I'm finding today and previously, and perhaps you as well, that there's just so much worth talking about with one another because there's so much agreement. And looking at Abraham, some of those stories sounded very familiar to me as well. You can either look at the stories that I'm going to tell or you can listen to them. It's up to you. I printed out some copies though. If you wouldn't mind just taking one and passing them around. I'll start some over there and some over here, and I'm just going to take the top copy for myself. Oh, sorry. More. Here you are. I'll take one more. Thank you. Okay, so from the perspective of somebody today, we get the entire stories of Abraham's life after he's already lived them. But he's a human being, and who he is at the early part of his life and who he is at the latter part of his life, he's somebody that grows. And he's somebody who responds differently in different circumstances, so it's not always clear, and he's not a robot. So you can't just say about Abraham in the Jewish tradition that he always responds this way faced with that, or he always has this to say, or he always has that to say. Actually, what we know of him, the stories that they tell, is that depending upon who he is at the time, depending upon what he's faced with, he's actually a very complex kind of guy. He's actually somebody who grows and learns over time as well. I don't really have time. We only gave ourselves about 7 or 8 minutes per story. And there are books written about Abraham. So I have just 2 to share, and one for right now. It starts on page 2. And at the top it says, Abram and Melchizedek. Avram, or Abram, was his name before it was changed by God to Abraham. Don't need to go into his name change. But this is the story about Avram, Abram, meeting somebody named Melchizedek. The story comes from the Torah. It comes from Jewish sacred scripture. And it's at the very top of page 2. It says Melchizedek. We don't get a huge introduction to who this guy is. His name in Hebrew means the righteous king. Melchi comes from Melech, which is king. Tzedek, righteous or just, however you want to translate it. But Melchizedek was the king of a place called Shalem. And he brought forth bread and wine. He, that is Melchizedek, was a priest to God Most High. That sounds exactly like the same sort of God that Jews worship. He, that is Melchizedek, blessed him, that is Avram, Abraham, saying, Blessed be Avram of God Most High, creator of heaven and of earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your foes into your hand. And Abram gave him, that's Melchizedek, 1/10 of everything. Now this is a really brief story, and it's confused a great many people because a lot of people think that when Abraham was alive, he was probably the only person worshiping God. Maybe his wife Sarah as well, maybe a few people in his family orbit that he managed to convince. But who in the world is this king, Melchizedek, who's not just somebody who believes in God alongside Abraham during his lifetime, meaning he didn't get what he knows and he didn't get what he believes from Abraham the prophet. He's listed as a priest of God Most High. So not only does he believe in God, he serves God in some way or another. So rabbinic tradition, which isn't quite as old as the Torah, but still goes back almost 2,000 years, rabbinic tradition has been trying to answer the question, who's Melchizedek and what's he doing with Abraham? And what does Abraham get out of the encounter? What does Melchizedek get out of the encounter? And what does this tell us about how Abraham responds to other people? So another source, this is again from rabbinic literature, it's almost 1,800 years old. It says, Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, brought forth bread and wine. So one rabbi, Shmuel, Samuel, Bar Nachman, and the sages offered varied interpretations. This is typical in Judaism, by the way. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said that Melchizedek revealed to Abraham the laws of the high priesthood. Bread is an allusion to the showbread, and wine is an allusion to the libations. Now, Jews up until about 2,000 years ago, so it stopped about 2,000 years ago, but up until about 2,000 years ago, Jews worship God through sacrifice, through a temple in Jerusalem, and prior to that, a tabernacle that moved around, somewhat portable. And that was the main way of worshiping God. All of these symbols right here, the showbread, the wine, everything else, was a way that Jews carried out the ritual inside the temple to worship God. What the rabbis are saying here is that Abraham learned how to do that. The very first Jewish person, according to Jewish tradition, Abraham learned how to do that from somebody who's not even Jewish. From a high priest or a priest to God Most High, so definitely a fellow monotheist, but not somebody who's in the same tradition as him. It says that a huge part of Judaism actually comes from somebody who's not Jewish. They continue on. The sages, early rabbis, say, Melchizedek revealed Torah to him. Torah is the Hebrew word for teaching. And it could mean either the first 5 books of our Bible, it could also mean all of Jewish wisdom and teaching, or any subset of it. As it is stated, come and partake my bread and drink of the wine. So these things are meant to nourish, bread, wine, etc. So just as Torah, just as Jewish teaching is meant to nourish, a lot of where he got this from was actually from somebody who's not Jewish. Okay, the next part is a slightly different story, but the same two people. There's the story between our two traditions, but there's a bit of a difference, where Abraham attempts to sacrifice his son to God. Isaac or Ishmael, depending upon which source you're reading. For this part of the story, it doesn't really matter which one. At the end of it, after an angel makes clear to Abraham, don't sacrifice your son, that's not what God wants, Abraham calls the place where that happened Adonai Yireh, which means God appeared here. Yireh means appear, Adonai is God. At the mountain, Adonai, that's God, appears. Another rabbinic story. Abraham called this place where he tried to sacrifice his son Yireh. As it is stated, Abraham called the name of that site Adonai Yireh. God was seen here. However, Shem is another name for Melchizedek that we learned about, called it Shalem. We got that from before, king of Shalem. As it is stated, Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, the holy blessed one, that's God, said, if I called that place Yireh, that's what Abraham calls it, then Shem, Melchizedek, who's a righteous man, would have grounds for complaint. I'd be choosing one over the other. If, however, I call it Shalem, then Abraham, a righteous man, would have grounds for complaint. Rather, I will call it Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, in accordance with what both of them called it, Yireh and Shalem, Jerusalem. We'll leave off that last source for right now. The reason why I wanted to share this with you is because, on the one hand, Jews call God the God of Israel. Israel meaning, yes, the state, but Israel is the word that we use for the Jewish people. It's one of the names that we use for the Jewish people. So we call God the God of Israel. That's not meant for us to say that we don't also believe that God is the God of the whole world. And I've been trying to figure out that metaphor in my mind, and we'll see if it works. Queen Elizabeth, she is the Queen of England. That's not to say that she's not also the Queen of Canada and the Queen of Australia and the Queen of all these different places. And all these different places have their own laws and their own rules and their own way of doing things. Yet that's still the same person. That's still the same queen. Different title, different relationships perhaps with different countries where the Commonwealth exists. Perhaps that's one way of looking at God. Jews have Jewish law, Jewish custom, their own way of doing things. But going as far back as our very earliest sources, the Hebrew Bible, it's clear that the Hebrew Bible, from its point of view, there's actually a lot of different peoples who also worship God, Melchizedek being one of them, and we recognize that as absolutely legitimate, as absolutely great. From a Jewish point of view, you don't need to be Jewish in order to be a good, righteous person. Judaism is open to anybody who wants to be Jewish, but we don't believe that it's the one and only way of doing it. Melchizedek gives us the example of how you can be a priest to God Most High and still be outside of, say, the Jewish family. So the reason why I wanted to share that with everyone today is because here we are, Jewish, Muslim, different ways perhaps of worshiping God. Different ways, different traditions, and yet still the same God. Still ultimately different people doing the best that they can, according to their best understanding, to be true to their faith, to be true to God. So I wanted to share that with you. I know we were going back and forth between various sources, but this series of sources, it's thousands of years old at the oldest. And the newest source material, which we didn't get to, Rashi, is almost 1,000 years old. So this is not a new idea for Jews. This is actually something that's really part of our tradition. The notion that people all over the world have the possibility to be faithful, have access to God, what have you. That it's not just about Judaism. Judaism's right for the Jews, definitely. But Abraham and Melchizedek kind of coming together in perhaps the first interfaith meeting that went really, really well in the history of the world. I think it's pretty inspiring. And it's something that informs me as I go and take part in these discussions with Omar, with others from the Muslim community or Christian community, what have you as well. So let me give it back to Omar now.
Thank you. Fantastic. I feel I should stand up, actually. I was a bit rude in that first one. Okay, so what we covered then in the first half of the discussion was the significance of Abraham, his importance to Muslims, and then phase one of Abraham's life, faith, a reasoned approach. Now, what connects phase one and phase two, for me, is a natural progression. Not just a natural progression for Abraham, but potentially a natural progression for any single human being. See, Abraham, he comes to the conclusion that there is an intelligent, powerful creator. A creator who created the universe, everything in existence. But what he also then realizes is that this creator also made food for him to eat, water to drink, air to breathe, a mind to think, eyes to see, ears to hear, a tongue to speak, a beating heart. Blessings upon blessings, favors upon favors. What Abraham then goes on to realize is that this creator is not only intelligent and powerful, but he is also loving and kind, caring and compassionate, merciful and generous. And for Abraham, this instills within him a love for the Creator, an affection towards the Creator, an affinity towards his Creator. And I said that this was something natural. See, if someone does a favor to you, your natural inclination is to want to thank that person. If someone does a favor to you over and over and over again, we start to warm towards that person. We build a soft spot in our heart for that person. We start to incline affectionately towards that person. The best example I can give for this, and probably of relevance for today, is the mother and her child. The kind of love and affection that a mother shows to her child. And this is something that personally I've witnessed more so over the past 15 months since my daughter's been born. And just seeing how my wife has raised our baby daughter. Don't get me wrong, fathers, we try our best. Seriously, Jason, we try our best, right? You know, as fathers, we really do. But what a mother does for her child is special. It's something incredible. And for me, when I realize I see what my wife does for her own child, for my child as well, it makes me appreciate more what my mum has done for me. It makes me want to show my gratitude towards my mother. It makes me want to show my appreciation towards my own mother. Actually, it makes me want to be in the service of my mother. I want to be there for her. Whatever she wants from me, I want to be there for my mother. Bring this back to Abraham. Abraham realizes that God is more compassionate to his creation than a mother is to her own child. And so Abraham, he wants to show his appreciation to God. He wants to show his gratitude to his loving creator. He wants to be in the service of God. So phase two for Abraham then is servitude, submission to the creator. Now when it comes to submission, sometimes this may mean Abraham will need to put his reason to one side. Abraham may even need to put his own wishes, his own wants, his own desires to one side out of submission to God. And the example the story that I'm going to share, similar to what Jason actually touched upon, what I feel is the epitome of Abraham's submission to God, is where Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his own son. So as the Quranic narrative goes, Abraham, he sees a vision within a dream that he is to sacrifice his son. Now, I normally put a disclaimer at this point, especially with kids here as well, that if any of you go home tonight and see any frightening dreams of any sort, please roll over, go back to sleep. It's just a dream. For Abraham, dreams were a source of revelation, right? And you can imagine what he's going through. This child of his, this son of his, is the apple of his eye. You can imagine any parent. That child means the world to them. That child is their everything. It's as if God is saying to Abraham, are you willing to give up everything for me, for your faith, for your love and submission of me. So as the story proceeds, Abraham, he actually in the Quranic narrative asks his son, he says, son, I've seen this vision, I've seen this dream. What do you think? And his son says, Father, do as you've been commanded. And God willing, you will find me of those who are patient. So he takes his son, they both go to the mountaintop, the hilltop, and just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, revelation comes down. Abraham, you don't need to sacrifice your son, you have passed the test. This for me is the pinnacle of Abraham's submission to God. This for me is Abraham putting his faith into practice. It is Abraham putting his faith in the form of submission and servitude to his Creator. And incidentally, if anyone was interested in knowing what the word submission translates to in the Arabic language, Islam. That's Islam. It's Islam. So tying everything that we've touched upon today together, Abraham has a huge weight within Islam, that his phase one of his journey begins with faith, with a reasoned approach to the one creator of the universe, of existence, of mankind. And that then translates to phase two, submission. Submitting to the will of the Creator. For Muslims, we believe that this will of the Creator, what the Creator wants for us to do here on earth, is found within the Quran, within the final book of God, and in the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. And what that looks like, practically speaking, on a day-to-day basis, really, is prayer. Praying 5 times a day to God, and doing charitable good deeds to the creation of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I remember as a kid growing up listening to my rabbi speak, telling us the story about how Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son and said, this really is a story of obedience. And later on I learned that Kierkegaard, philosopher, not Jewish, but philosopher, called Abraham, because of that episode, a biblical knight of faith. Somebody who acted on their faith. The story I'm going to share next seems like it's completely counter to that notion of submission, but I don't know that it's actually as far off as it might appear. But it is one of the stories about Abraham in the Torah that I come back to over and over again. It's a story where Abraham is talking with God, and God is about to do something that doesn't directly affect Abraham, but God wants to run the idea past Abraham anyways. God is about to destroy 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities, in God's judgment, were wicked enough to merit destruction. And normally what we've seen in the past is if God wants to do something, God's not going to consult with a human being. God will just do it. But for whatever reason, God decided that let me just raise the idea with Abraham and see how he reacts. And so God tells Abraham his plan. I've seen the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham's reaction is not whatever you say, God. It sounds, or it appears, that Abraham's actually rebelling against the idea that these 2 cities should be destroyed. Abraham gets up and says, you're going to destroy an entire city or an entire 2 cities? What if there's 50 innocent people in those cities? Are you going to destroy it with those 50 innocent people there? Shall not, this is Abraham's words, shall not the judge of the whole earth deal justly? That sounds a bit like insubordination. That Abraham's almost rebelling against God. God comes back and says, if there's 50 innocents, I won't destroy the city. Abraham said, what if those 50 lack 5? God says, okay, if there's 45 innocent, I won't destroy them. 40, 30, 20, 10, back and forth. And each time Abraham challenging God a little bit further, and each time God agreeing with Abraham. They go as low as 10. Abraham doesn't push it any further than 10. And at the end, I suppose God can't find the 10 because God destroys the cities. Now, the reason why I like to come to that is because so often when we read Jewish sources, it's clear that God really doesn't appreciate a whole bunch of challenges. The big example is idolatry. God really, in the Hebrew Bible, does not approve of people making idols and worshiping them because it's a challenge to God. Or in some cases, it's a disbelief in God, whatever you want to call it. So what's the difference between this and that? Why is God entertaining this discussion to begin with? That Abraham is saying, almost taking the position of defense attorney on behalf of these two wicked cities. And I think it's because Abraham is using his best moral intuition. Notice they actually never disagree. God never disagrees with Abraham. So it's possible God was in the same place all along. And God knew how this was going to play out. So it's not like God was saying, you know what, even if there are 50 innocent, I'll still wipe them out. God never actually says that. God never actually says, if there's 40 innocent, I'll still wipe them out. So there's never really a strong disagreement, but it definitely comes across that way. But here's what Abraham's doing. He's using his best moral intuition to raise what he believes to be a moral objection to God. And God's actually okay with that in the Torah. It's not as though Abraham's motivated by evil intention. It's not like Abraham is trying to do the wrong thing. He's trying to do the right thing. Eventually, it turns out they're actually probably in the same place agreement-wise. So it works out that way. But in terms of what's motivating Abraham, what's motivating him is a sense of justice or a sense of injustice. And for that, God is actually perfectly content with Abraham continuing on the way that he goes. I tell this to people all the time. I say, if something's bothering you, if you have a real reason to raise your voice, do so. It's what our father Abraham did. In fact, Jewish tradition really loves Abraham for having done this. At the bottom, there's a quote from something called the Zohar, which is this mystical interpretation of the Torah. And I won't read it word for word, but essentially what it is the rabbis are comparing two prophets. Poor Noah, he always comes off poorly. He's a prophet, he's a wonderful guy, and I don't want to come across against it, but when compared to Abraham, he always comes off kind of at the lower end of the comparison. They say, when Noah was told by God that God was going to bring a flood and destroy the entire world, build an ark, you know what Noah said to everybody? Nothing. He did exactly what God told him to do. He built the ark. He survived the flood. There's no criticism in that necessarily. But when Abraham found out that people were going to be destroyed, he stood up and said, can we work something out here? In Jewish tradition, one rabbi said that the definition of a prophet is somebody who's both a friend to God and a friend to people. And you can't just be on the side of one and not the other. You have to care about both God and people in order to be a good prophet and a good leader. When a prophet is speaking to people, they represent God. And when a prophet is speaking to God, they're trying to really make space for people to improve and do better, and so on. Jewish tradition also says that it's not the death of the sinner that God seeks, rather it's the end of the sin itself. Perhaps that's what Abraham is trying to do here. Either give people a chance to repent, save the innocent, whatever it is, but that real concern for justice, even to the point of raising the concern to God, is something that to me is really powerful and something that I appreciate about Abraham. How that squares with the story that he never objected to God over the sacrifice of his son. He never said, my son is innocent, leave him out of this. I don't know. These stories exist side by side. Perhaps they don't contradict one another. Maybe they do. I don't know. He's a complex guy. He's a human being like the rest of us. God, we expect to be pretty consistent. Human beings, even prophets, not always. So there's that second story. We've left plenty of time for questions, either for me or for Omar or for both. So if you have any questions, please feel free. Just let us know who the question is directed to. We'll go ahead, we'll repeat it so that it's heard over the microphone. Sun's in your eyes. We'll make sure that's taken care of. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, either about what you've heard or perhaps something a bit more general, is that okay? We're here for you. Yes.
I've got a question.
Okay, yeah.
It's a general question. Do you think it matters if Abraham actually didn't exist?
Do I think it matters that Abraham
I
didn't...
didn't say that, I said if, because I'm not passing that.
Oh, got it, sorry.
I'm not going to give my opinion. I'm not passing
Is the question to me or to Omar?
Is it to either of you, to be honest with you? I don't know. I'm thinking from a Jewish point of view,
Yeah.
it probably doesn't matter at all if Abraham didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if it matters from an Islamic point of view, then if Abraham didn't exist, but merely somebody at a point in time took themselves across from one part to that part and did some monotheism and sort of brought with them a monotheistic approach to life.
Mm-hmm.
That's my question. I think it's because something one of my class, I think, asked me.
Okay, so the question is, does it matter if
Yes.
Abraham actually existed?
Yes.
A lot of this we have to take either on a bit of faith here, meaning we didn't have video cameras in the back, like the one that we have in the back around when Abraham... Yes. Oh, it's going right over your head, so... we didn't have the benefit of recording techniques that we have nowadays. What we have is books of Revelation, scripture, stories told from one generation to the next. Did it get down to us? Did it not? Omar spoke a little bit to us about reason. If you wanted to prove that Abraham existed according to the tools of logic and evidence available today, it'd probably come across as fairly inconclusive at best. One thing that a teacher of mine taught me, this was more about the creation of the world in 6 days. On the first day, God made this. Second day, God made that, etc., etc. She raised the question, does it matter if this is true? So it's a slightly different question, but maybe related enough. And she said, what she told me was, so many people ask that question, is this story true? She said, if that's bothering you, set it aside and ask a different question. What truth is there in the story?
Yes.
And we can definitely look to these stories and say, what truth is there in these stories? About, is there a creator? About, does that creator ask anything of us as people? What are we prepared to do because we believe our creator wants us to do it? What are we prepared to give up? These are all questions that we can ask that almost don't even turn on the historicity of the actual stories.
I think Judaism can cope with that.
Judaism can definitely cope with
I
that.
would love to know how Islam, from the Islamic point of view.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think Abraham, obviously, from what we've said, such big significance, importance in Islam. But the question, I've looked at your question from a different angle, actually, from the way that you've answered it. It's really interesting hearing your answer. I've looked at it from the angle of, would we still be able to worship God? Will we still be able to have faith in God without Abraham? And the answer to that for me is yes. Because Abraham, as much as we've learnt from him, messengers, prophets in general, are vessels towards God. God is who we are here to worship. The messengers help us. But essentially, and go back to that phase 1 of Abraham's life, potentially he didn't need any prophets or messengers to have that faith in God. It was based on his reason. It was based on his senses of the universe. So in terms of belief, from that angle and that perspective, no, not necessarily. I don't think it would change anything in that respect. But what Abraham's taught us is obviously of great significance and importance.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to put the question, but you talked, Omar, about his submission. And that is what's so striking about the sacrifice that didn't happen of his son Isaac, that he submitted apparently to God's will, and yet, I'm sure we've all wrestled with it at some time or another, it's such a negation of everything that's preceded that the chapters preceding that in the book of Genesis describe how he's going to have a son, and that he's going to be the father of great nations, and yet here he is being told apparently to sacrifice his son, and he submits. Are you not critical of that submission?
Good question. So the question was based on, I talked a lot about submission, and that Abraham is asked to submit in sacrificing his own son, but that seems to contradict what goes before that, in that Abraham is promised through his son that there will be later generations and descendants, right? So interestingly, there are three opinions in Islam as to which son, in terms of the sacrifice of the son. You might say, wait, there were two sons. Where's the third opinion? The first opinion is that the son was Ishmael, not Isaac. And actually this is the dominant opinion because of what you said, because that Abraham, it was his first son who was to be sacrificed, and in that if Abraham already knew that through this son, we believe to have been Isaac, he knew there were going to be descendants from Isaac, then why does God ask him to sacrifice his son? Abraham would have known that actually, God, you've already promised me that through this other son of mine, I'm going to have descendants. So that's why opinion one, the majority of Muslims will say actually it was Ishmael who was to be sacrificed. Opinion two, there is an opinion that it was Isaac, and maybe if I'm going to stretch my mind, God he can change his mind, potentially. So he may have said to Abraham, through Isaac you will have descendants, and yet and yet God now, he may want to change his mind. That's a minority opinion in Islam. But the third opinion, actually what probably is of more interest to me and appeals to me more, is actually looking at the story. It's not as of much relevance as to which son was to be sacrificed. Within the Islamic narrative, there's not this understanding that because this son is chosen, therefore the message, the promise, the covenant will be in this son. That doesn't exist really within Islam. It's more that you have a son who means so much to you, now obey my command and sacrifice your son. And so within Islam, both Isaac and Ishmael are seen as great prophets of God, and there's great relevance of both of them. Through Ishmael come the Arabs and Muhammad, and through Isaac, the great prophets, Jacob, Joseph, Zechariah, Moses, so on. So I hope that answers your question, but I can see how it can be difficult to square, I guess, from that perspective. Is there a quick question at the back?
Yeah, Tom, quick question.
Answered it, Omar. Sorry, it's going to sound silly, but to something else. With the relationship in Islam to Ishmael, again, apparently, what I've read, and I sort of got it the wrong way. Apparently, he's sometimes credited as the first Arabic person. Bearing in mind that a large proportion of practicing Islams are not Arabic. So, this is going to sound like this will be a silly question. I'm sorry about.
No, not at all.
But put it another way, if you're at your mosque in Indonesia, and if you're in your church in Cairo, where does Ishmael fit in for you?
Very good.
If you're not Arabic but a practicing Muslim, but if you're Arabic but you're not a practicing Muslim, what bearing does Ishmael have in relation?
Very good, very good. Thank you. So the question is, Ishmael is recognized as the first Arab. Therefore, what significance today do we have for Muslims who aren't Arabs compared to, say, you mentioned Egyptian Christians who aren't Muslim? So you're right. So in terms of Islam, Ishmael is recognized as the first Arab. But what I would say is that within Islam, race is of no significance. It just so happens that Ishmael was of Arab well, he was the first Arab. But actually, for Muslims, and that understanding of Abraham's message is worldwide. So the message of Islam is what is of most importance. The race, the culture, the ethnicity of it being Arab makes no difference. You can still be the best Muslim or the best one who submits to the will of God as an Indonesian, as someone from any race and background.
But for an Arabian, for an Arabian Christian, I know races are relevant, but for an Arab who's not a practicing Muslim, where does that leave you?
For an Arab that's not a practicing Muslim, then that person's an Arab in terms of their ethnicity, but it makes no difference in terms of their religion. We separate their religion from the religion of Islam. God looks at people who, let's put it this way, God's benchmark for us here in life is how best can we worship God. And for us as Muslims, we believe that the tradition of Islam, that submission of Islam is what will get us through a day of judgment, which I guess we've touched upon in the past, and maybe might open a can of worms here today. But an Egyptian Christian, that notion in Christianity of, say, the Trinity, it wouldn't reconcile. It's incompatible with that understanding of Abraham, of a creator, and the rest of us as creation. So what's more important is actually the faith, the religion, more than the culture.
Thank you.
Thank you both for the information you've given us.
Thank you.
I have one question, and if the answer goes one way, then I want to say more things. If it goes the other way, then I want to explain a little more of what I say. Does God actually speak to Abraham after the Isaac incident at all?
The question is, does God speak to Abraham after Abraham attempts to sacrifice his son? In Jewish sources, no. That's the end of it. In fact, that's raised a whole line of commentary that God tells Abraham, sacrifice your son. In the Torah, God's not the one that tells Abraham to stop, it's an angel. And never again do we have a recording of God speaking to Abraham. Now, why is that? Abraham's given a test of faith. Abraham seems to pass the test of faith, and he's rewarded by silence from God. Now, you could argue that if you hear a voice from an angel of God, it's not that much different than hearing from God, because angels aren't really these independent beings wandering around. They're essentially just extensions of God's will. They're not really out to... We don't have in Judaism this notion of angels rebelling against God or angels exhibiting free will. When you hear an angel, it's really just an extension of God's will, I suppose. But nonetheless, it's interesting that the text goes out of its way to say an angel spoke to Abraham, and that we never have a conversation between Abraham and God again. Definitely between, say, God and Isaac and God and plenty of other people. And why did that end? So, to go on majority-minority viewpoints, there's the majority viewpoint that Abraham did the right thing by attempting to sacrifice his son. There's a minority viewpoint, but remember in Judaism we preserve minority viewpoints, and sometimes we're very persuaded by them. I'm persuaded by plenty of minority viewpoints, and that I wish had gone the majority way, and perhaps I'm very persuaded by this one too. But there is a viewpoint that Abraham failed the test. There's a viewpoint that says actually it would have been better if Abraham took the same route that he did with Sodom and Gomorrah and did it for his son and said, I might be going crazy, I don't know this voice, I think it's God, but I must be nuts because there's no way a just God would ever command this of me. Or, so perhaps that's one tack. Or perhaps another would be for Abraham to say, I will do anything you want, God, but Isaac, my son, is innocent, I'm not touching him. He could have gone that way, and maybe that's what God wanted him to do. And maybe he failed the test. There is that viewpoint as well. Like I said, majority viewpoint is Abraham did exactly what he was supposed to. You know, I always had trouble with that submission story until one day I was sitting in a study session in Israel where they have mandatory military service, and somebody had chosen to move to Israel from America where you can have a very comfortable life, no mandatory military service. And she says, I'm risking my life, and particularly my son's life, who now has to go into the army. I'm willing for him to die by me moving here. And she looked at the story of Abraham here and said, he had to put his son's life on the line. I'm putting my son's life on the line. And regardless of how you feel about that in particular, actually all sorts of people are willing to give up their life for something. My father was a firefighter for 25 years. He definitely ran into burning buildings and put his life on the line. People are willing to at least make a sacrifice, sometimes the sacrifice of their own life, all the time. The question is what you're putting your life on the line for worth it? And is it the right cause and the right reason? Because actually we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble if we're willing to kill ourselves or willing to put other people's life in the line for the wrong reasons. That could be incredibly evil. But this story opens the possibility that maybe there's things worth dying for, I suppose. It's hard. I sometimes wonder, how would I have reacted in this situation? And I don't know. But on the other hand, I think that you could definitely make a case that Abraham might not have, his response might not have been the most pleasing to God. Because God never spoke to Abraham again.
Year on year, coming to the high holy days,
Yeah.
the story becomes more and more unbearable.
Yeah.
I feel for Sarah. She dies shortly after this incident.
Mm-hmm.
Isaac isn't allowed to choose his own bride. Father organizes that. It's just too much. And yet he's such a many-faceted person. It's as though he came to a point at which he crashed. He couldn't go on maintaining that high standard.
Yeah. We definitely don't think that story was easy for anybody involved, by the way. The whole sacrifice, even if they did the right thing, and we can allow for that, nobody would suggest that that was easy. In fact, part of the reason that, even if you are on board with the idea, part of the reason why it's so significant is it wasn't easy. The very next story in Jewish sources, the Torah, after the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of his son, attempted sacrifice of his son, is that Sarah dies. And it doesn't say what caused her death, except Jewish tradition has always understood it that a likely reason for her dying is she got wind of what happened, that Abraham tried to kill their son, and she died of heartbreak. She wasn't even consulted. Yeah, you're right. Here we are on Mother's Day. Here we are on Mother's Day talking about Abraham, who did not consult his wife that he was about to attempt to sacrifice their only son together. Abraham had more than one son, but the two of them together had one son. And Abraham attempts to sacrifice without consulting Sarah, and she dies of a heartbreak. You're right. It's really challenging for everybody involved.
They left early in the morning so that she didn't find out. Not till it was too late.
I never thought of it that way. They did leave early in the morning. The traditional explanation is always Abraham rushed to fulfill a commandment of God. And so that's always considered, in classical sources, a merit to Abraham. No, you're absolutely right. There's definitely a strong tradition of critiquing Abraham for his response to it, even if it's not the majority tradition. Questions? Yes. John.
One story that occurs 3 times that we always feel a little uncomfortable about is Abraham pretending to be or claiming to be the brother of his wife when he says to her, "Pretend to be my sister." To the Pharaoh, and then 2 other situations. And although you can see the logic behind why he did this, it seems like a pretty dishonest thing to do, because potentially getting his wife into big trouble, totally unacceptable trouble. does Islam have something to say about this?
Thank you. So the question is that Abraham, when he is with his wife, asks her to be to say that she is his sister, and that is in the presence of the Pharaoh. Right. So within Islam, the Quran is silent on this story, but when we look into the narrations, so Islam, you have two sources generally: the Quran, which we believe is the revealed word of God, and then you have what are called the Hadith, or the historical reports that come from Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad. And if my memory serves me well, there is, I recollect, mention of this within these reports. I would have to check in terms of the authenticity, but let's go with it. What, and from what I understand and remember, was that Abraham tells his wife to say, "You are my sister," in order to save her from getting into some sort of trouble.
No, it's to save him.
Right. Well, then he's
afraid they'll kill him in order to take his wife.
So let's say it's to save him then. Abraham's use of the word sister could be used to say sister in faith. So like, for example, "You are my sister in faith." You could say, in order to save a life, call it, I don't want to say if it's twisting the truth, it's something true, but to Abraham and to his wife, the way that the Pharaoh has interpreted it is obviously going to be in a different sense. But if we're talking about to save a life, it's not an outright lie, it's a twist, say, of the truth. So that would be my understanding of it. It's not as if Abraham is someone who is lying outright, because that's not morally right of a prophet or someone at least of Abraham's status. But there is that truth within it. But yeah, I'm going to look that up actually. Thank you for sharing it.
It recurs 3 times, and every time we read it, you just sort of feel uncomfortable about it.
Let me give you another actually, because you've jogged my memory. Within the Quran, we have where there's a festival, and Abraham, it's a festival, so idolatrous festival, and Abraham is asked to come and join them during their festival. Abraham, within the Quran, he says, "Inni saqim," I am sick. I feel sick. I don't want to come out today. Now, he wasn't sick in what maybe medically would say someone is sick, but then you look at it in a different angle. Maybe he's sick spiritually. I'm sick of all of the idolatry and the pagan sort of worship that is going on. I'm not coming out today. So for Abraham, again, there's that sense. He does... I don't want to call it twisting the truth. He looks at it at a different angle, let's say. So there is that notion there as well within Islam.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, if there are any. In that case, let me just say thank you, Omar. We are so fortunate to have you as a friend of the synagogue and for you to come out and share with us about Abraham the prophet, and also to share your time today as well, and
pleasure's
on
all
other
mine.
occasions as well.
Thank you for having us.
I think it's fantastic that the synagogue and Al-Emaan are developing a relationship with one another. This isn't the only time that we do things together. Other things include through the Bromley Three Faiths Forum. We have this babies and toddlers group that goes back and forth between the mosque and the synagogue. So there's a lot of new and developing programs between the two, and I think it's absolutely fantastic the direction that we're going in. And I'm grateful to Omar and to others from Al-Emaan on being leaders in that and taking part in that friendship between us. So thank you, Omar,
thank
for
you very
coming
much.
along.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Can I just, on behalf of the synagogue, thank you so much, Omar, and your fellow worshippers from the mosque. It's just
It was very interesting.
It's wonderful to be together.
Thank you.
It really is.
so much.
Thanks very